The mishap report of a fatal CH147 Chinook accident that happened in 2023 was recently released, and it's a stark reminder of how dangerous spatial disorientation can be, especially the unrecognized kind. We're going to take a look at the mishap report, break down what we can, and see if we can get any lessons learned from it. The date of the report was 7 October 2024. It's a Class A mishap. On the evening of 19 June 2023, the crew of Hammer 3-1 on board aircraft CH147-310 was scheduled to conduct 2 advanced night tests as part of the Tactical First Officer course. Flight was planned for a total of 4 hours, with each test taking 2 hours to complete. The 2 student pilots undergoing training conducted a crew change at the halfway point of the 4-hour mission. The instructor pilot and 2 flight engineers remain on board for the complete duration of the mission. The accident occurred during the second portion of the mission, shortly after the 2 student pilots' crew change. 2 pilots and 2 flight engineers were on board the aircraft at the time of the accident. The accident crew departed from final approach and takeoff area 17 to fly to confined area Tango 40 in training area Echo. Shortly after departure, the instructor pilot simulated an engine chip emergency. Remember, we've talked about this on other mishaps, how important that is with a helicopter. You've got to get on the ground, which required the aircraft to return for landing. After the emergency scenario was completed, again, simulated, the crew departed again for final approach and takeoff area 17 to fly to confined area Tango 40. During the turn towards confined area Tango 40, the aircraft started to descend. While descending and still established in left turn, the helicopter impacted the Ottawa River with high energy. Helicopter was destroyed. The 2 pilots were fatally injured in the accident, while the 2 flight engineers successfully egressed the helicopter, receiving only minor injuries. That is amazing. Wow. I mean, high energy impact and anybody survived is miracle. The investigation determined that when the crew initiated the turn towards area T40, the aircraft entered a constant descent. None of the crew members realized the height and or rate of descent of the aircraft before impact, resulting in control flight into terrain accident. It was concluded that the unperceived acceleration and the environmental conditions that night were key factors that played a role in this incident, contributing to the spatial disorientation experienced by the crew. The investigation made numerous recommendations to amend the CH147F publications, including a recommendation to mandate the use of Automation Level 3 Native Mode Digital Automatic Flight Control System when operating below 200 feet above water at night. Additional recommendations were made to improve emergency response. So that's the synopsis. We'll see what we can glean from the report itself. All right, so the history of the flight. On the evening of 19 June, they were Hammer 3-1. They were doing the TAFO course. So basically, 2 student pilots getting checked out in the aircraft with an IP and 2 flight engineers that were staying. It's basically takeoffs and landings, simulate emergency, tactical navigation, confined area landings, and sling operations at night. Accident occurred during the second portion with the new student after the hot turn of the 2 student pilots occurred just before midnight. There were 4 crew members on board. When the student pilot took position in the right seat after the hot turn, the IP started to quiz the student pilot and then proceeded with before taxi check. That's a very Army thing to do. I've got a friend that flies for the Army and has said that they like to do quizzes and stuff in the airplane. We don't really do that in the Air Force or Navy. As Gonky has pointed out, the worst classroom is the airplane. You know it on the ground, you know it in the brief, you know it during your EPE, emergency procedures evaluation, your NATOPS check, and your debrief. But quizzing in the airplane is an Army thing, and it's stupid. I don't like it. I think it's a bad practice. I've had Army pilots that I've flown with try to do that to me and in training, and I think it's a terrible practice that professional pilots shouldn't be doing. You should be worried about your procedures and not playing stump the dummy. But I'm not saying this is causal. This is just an aside. During this check, the setting of the RAD-out low approach warning indicator index or RAD-out bug was omitted. I wonder why. Because you're busy being quizzed on stupid stuff that doesn't matter. While taxiing to the final approach and takeoff area 17 for departure, the crew set up their NVGs, commonly referred to as goggle up procedure. Crew briefed to departure for tactical navigation leg direct to the T40 confined area and training area Echo at a plane ground speed of 90 knots. They departed FATO 17 to the south with a left-hand turn northbound towards T40. Then he gave them the engine ship emergency, which was simulated, of course, which led to a landing back at the FAT 017. Preparation for landing, the radar bug was set to 125. During the approach, the low altitude audio caution from the rad out sounded, verbally acknowledged, and canceled by the student pilot. It was a successful landing. Crew briefed another departure as briefed previously, direct to T40. Second leg was depicted by the red line figure 1, which we'll see in a minute. After completing a vertical departure southbound, the IP simulated an NVG failure. So now it's nighttime. You're using your night vision goggles to see outside, and now you've lost that. So it's just pure darkness outside. You got to transition your instruments. At which time controls were passed to the IP. IP announced and initiated a left-hand turn. Upon regaining night vision goggles, controls were transferred back to the student pilot while still in the left-hand turn. So they started the turn. You have the aircraft. IP's flying. He's got NVGs. He's working a simulated NVG failure. Gets them back. Gets control back, but they're still in that turn. So they were a third of the planned 150-degree turn. The IP then advised the student pilot of a trim roll right advisory, which SP attempted to rectify once without success. Crew then conducted before landing check, and the IP briefed navigation instructions to T40. Speed and altitude were briefed to be at student pilot's discretion. As the navigation details were being discussed between the pilots, the low altitude caution from the rad out sounded and was promptly canceled by one of the two pilots with no acknowledgement or corrective actions. So they are still in this turn. They get their first rad out warning and they cancel it and don't acknowledge the fact that they're descending. The aircraft decelerated slightly and the cabin door called height 20 feet above water. The aircraft impacted the river at just after midnight, approximately 1.5 kilometers from their departure point, and there's the figure. So they're in this turn right here, and that's where they ended up. So it's just this shallow descent into the river. Two pilots were fatally injured. Amazingly, that the FEs egressed. That's amazing. Aircraft was destroyed due to the high impact force with water. Damage was found in the cockpit area, cabin floor, front right-hand sponson, the right-hand fuel tank area, front landing gear, rotor blades, aircraft underbelly, engines survived damage. Crew was qualified. The aircraft captain, or aircraft commander, as we call it in the States, first officer, two flight engineers. So the AC was the IP and the FO was the student pilot. The IP had flown the Twin Huey, the Griffin, and the Chinook, and had 6,770 hours of military flying. So pretty experienced. The FO was brand new, had just joined in 2019 and had 185.6 hours with a total of 445.2 hours of military flying. The final test to complete the TAFO course, and he was in the right seat. FE was experienced with 657 hours, and the other FE had 1,200 hours. Looking back, last 30, 60, 90, they'd all been flying 10 hours in the last 30, 16 hours in the last, for the FO, 32 and 90. And then they had even been flying in the last 48 hours. So they might have been a little fatigued. For the student pilot progression, the FO course consists of the basic first officer course and the module called TAFO. Looking at his logbooks, he had failed one of the night tests on 2 occasions. He had difficulties related to ineffective use of visual references in the hover using night vision goggles. I mean, that's standard. All right, fatigue. Fatigue avoidance scheduling tool is a software developed for industry, military, and sports. As far as that, they estimated the fatigue risk a low, which is weird because you'd think midnight operations, it'd be pretty high. The night of the mishap, it was visual meteorological conditions prevailed. Few at 4,000, towering cumulus broken at 9,000, and then scattered 4,500 towering cumulus. Prognosis showed no adverse weather. Illumination on the night was low. And that's a thing with night vision goggles. They don't turn night into day. Night vision goggles work great when the moon is out and you got a source of illumination like that. But when there's no moon, it can be very dark and it can not give you the best horizon and the best clarity of picture. So low illumination night, high risk of spatial disorientation. All right, so the CVR had them stepping on each other, but here's the activities and tasks. They took off, communicated with the MFOW, back to cruise call, simulated NVG scenario, passing controls from student pilot to IP. IP called the left turn. Student pilot got his goggles back. He got the controls back. IP call for the before landing checklist. Then they got a trim roll right advisory, which probably was distracting. Completed the before landing checklist, and then was giving navigational directions. They had a rat out that went unacknowledged, and then verbally, but it was acknowledged with the switch to cancel it. And then the FE called height 20 above. Investigation noted a few breaks and pauses in the speech of the IP. There was a minor error when the takeoff advisory was made, where the IP indicated taking off from 3.5 when it's in fact 1.7. Boy, that sounds, I mean, that's easily mistaken, but boy, I mean, at that time of night, I wouldn't be. I know the computer said no fatigue, but it's a fatiguing time to be flying. So they looked at the flight data. They went to 315 feet at 2,000 feet per minute. And then small thrust control lever inputs. Bank angle was reduced from 36 degrees max to 25,000 feet per minute. You know, if you look at time to die charts, it's not a lot of time, especially at that altitude. They were reducing thrust control lever until impact. 54 seconds. It was 15 degrees. At the time of impact, the heading was 005 at 18 degrees angle of bank, 118 knots with an 800 foot a minute descent rate. Aircraft pitched from -2 to +4, from 127 to 118. No large flight control inputs are recorded in the data, which meant that they just flew into the ground or the water. They didn't know. It was unrecognized. And that's, you know, we talk about visual illusions, spatial disorientation, stuff like that. There is nothing more dangerous than unrecognized spatial disorientation, because what's unrecognized and you're not perceiving the horizon, you're not perceiving what the aircraft's doing. And when you look outside on a moonless night with over water, because water, nothing to reflect off of, right? You know, it can mirror whatever's in the sky, especially if there's nothing. It just looks like a black hole. So if it's dark sky, dark water, there's no horizon. And so looking outside doesn't work. You have to trust the round dials. You have to recognize, confirm, recover, and use your primary flight display, your attitude deviation indicator. And the problem with that is you have to recognize, which it sounds like that's unfortunately not what happened. All right. So the analysis, basically the aircraft was serviceable, crew was current and qualified, and the constant descent over 19 seconds is what caused this. Investigation focused on how that happened with all of these factors one by one. For increasing rate of descent being one of the biggest things, they started at 1,000 feet per minute. FDR data indicates that for a 7-second period, the aircraft was banked to approximately 36 degrees. Rotor thrust load factor was around 1. Maintaining a constant altitude at this bank requires 1.2, meaning that for 7 seconds, it wasn't enough thrust to set the proper altitude or attitude to maintain level flight. The turn, which was initiated by the IP, reached 36 degrees of bank, and the aircraft began descending before controls were handed to the SP. Standard practice to advise the other pilot of initiated flight maneuvers such as descent prior to transferring control. SP was not advised that the descent had been begun, which he could have looked at, though. I mean, but I think nobody was really cognizant of that fact. Thrust application when taking over the controls, SP maintained the same aircraft attitude and thrust setting for several seconds while the descent rate increased until the bank angle was reduced from 36 to 25, then started to lower the thrust lever once tree line was cleared. As this indicates, the SP was unaware of the descent. The investigation believes the initiation of the descent at the start of the turn while the bank was 36 degrees was possibly unintentional, nonetheless unrecognized by the crew. As bank angle was reduced to 25, the crew expected the aircraft to be at relatively constant altitude. Sounds like they were looking outside and not trusting their instruments, unfortunately. FDR information, specifically the variation in vertical speed, the investigation determined the change in acceleration forces felt by the crew was 0.074. Although possibly within the human body's detection range, would likely be masked by the vibration of the helicopter. So they didn't really feel it. And then the black hole effect, low illumination levels, glassy water factors when there's no wind. You get glassy water. Significantly decreased the level of contrast, especially using night vision goggles, made it difficult to assess their height above water and rate of descent. Furthermore, the Ottawa River, sitting 20 feet lower than the airfield located on the other side of the tree line, is obstructed by the tree line and benefits less from airfield illumination. When looking at the flight path of Hammer 3-1, both the SP-1 and SP-2 missions were flown almost exclusively over land. First leg of SP-2 followed the shore, except for the accident leg, which was flown over the river at that only time at night. As a result, the ability to use visual cues from crew's night vision goggles were negated, leaving only instruments to monitor their descent rate in the last 19 seconds. Cabin crew members also have responsibility. During the 61 second, there was only one mention of either altitude or rate of descent, and that's when he called 20 feet above water, which was said in a normal but firm tone, no other verbal cues, such as up, 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 to indicate an immediate climb. The most evident anomaly was that the student pilot's training took over 18 months, which should have been done in 7. It's determined that it's not an exceptional situation, and the similar timelines have been observed in the past. One of the consequences of this extended training period was numerous breaks in between training events. 7 breaks exceeding 7 calendar days were recorded, of which there were 3 of 30 days or more. It was determined that 3 of those breaks in which between different phases within the course itself, and that no review trips were allotted, so no warm-up flights and, hey, let's get back into things. For new students, that's a long time. That is a long time. It was reported during the investigation that the training flight is struggling to meet pilot production demands due to lack of instructor pilots, is very common across the world. The United States has this problem too. The extended training duration indicates there are other factors at play. Difficulties experienced by the training flight to meet pilot production demands might be the result of the IPs being assigned higher priority taskings. Known detriment. They weren't giving sufficient resources in terms of IPs and aircraft to complete what they needed to. Conclusions: the aircraft was serviceable. They were qualified. They were overbanking and not enough thrust to maintain level flight. Initiation of descent at the start of the turn while bank angle was 36 degrees was possibly unintentional. They couldn't have used their vestibular system to detect acceleration forces, resulting in unidentified increase in the rate of descent. Following a 7-second period of increasing descent rate, a constant vertical speed was maintained for the last 19 seconds. Accident leg was the first and only time Hammer 3-1 flew over the river. Crew did not use any of the recommended mitigating measures for overwater flight, follow shorelines, use native modes, and increase height above water. Environmental conditions, both illumination level and calm winds, created a black hole effect. As a result, the NVGs were negated. Last 19 seconds, the descent was unintentional. The last 19 seconds of the descent was likely intentional. They did not use a moving down call. When the controls were passed from the IP to the SP, the aircraft was still in the descent rate of 300 feet per minute. And there was no mention of the intent to descend at that point. Neither FE was aware of the descent rate or height of the aircraft. Crew members were unaware of the imminent danger from the proximity of the water. It's likely the time spent looking inside the cockpit combined with the black hole effect caused the FOSPF to lose situational awareness, then lowered thrust with the intent of reducing the airspeed. Task saturated, channelized attention on the airspeed, not looking at the rate of descent. We've talked about that. Task saturation, channelized attention can kill you. IP may not have been as alert during the second half of the mission. Fatigue. Rat out was canceled by one of the pilots, likely reflexively without processing the information. Task saturation is likely why the rat out warning was not acknowledged or responded. It was only verbalized once, despite being required 5 times during the hot turn. Mission tempo to compress the checklist leading to missing checks. At a height of 20 feet, the FE could have made a more assertive call, but it would not have recovered the aircraft. No specific mention of training exposure to the black hole effect. RCAF concluded that instructor continuity did not contribute. The low illumination would have raised the score to 5, which would have necessitated a flight supervisor approval, but it probably would have been granted. Variation in illumination assessment from 0.54 to 0.85 should have been high risk. They don't have a high fidelity spatial disorientation trainer, which is used by most of its allies. No lead agency to manage RCAF NVG training. NVG ground instructor qualification may not meet the intent of the NATO agreement. Consequently, RCAF training construct may lead to instructor knowledge fade. All right, so that's a pretty thorough report. Spatial disorientation kills. I've been spatially disoriented before. F-16, just about everything. It just happens. And the answer is to get on the round dials. So get on your in-cockpit gauges, recognize, confirm, recover, and trust your gauges, because your ear is going to be telling you one thing and the jet's going to probably be doing a different thing. So when it's unrecognized, you don't get that luxury of recognize or confirming. So it's deadly. I mean, you'd think in a crew aircraft, two people wouldn't be led down the same rabbit hole, but you have to understand they were doing other stuff. They weren't expecting that. You've got a new student pilot. You've got an IP that may have been not as fresh as he was the first couple sorties, not thinking about that. You have the aircraft, puts it in a shallow bank, and nobody recognizes it and flies a perfectly good aircraft in the water. They talked about being understaffed, which is a common problem, which leads to IP fatigue because they're flying so much because that's all they have to produce pilots, and students that end up with long breaks in training, so they're not getting the quality of training that they're used to or that they should be getting. So this is one of those scenarios that's incredibly tragic, and I feel for the families of those lost. And it's fortunate that the FEs, the flight engineers, were able to get out, because you look at this and go, how did anybody survive a 60 G impact? But, dark night, dark sky, no horizon, and not using your instruments and trying to look outside at low altitude that's what's going to happen. So, if you're flying at night, just remember, it'll kill you. It'll kill you fast too. So cross-check your instruments, always look inside, know what the aircraft is doing, and don't trust your inner ear. Trust what the instruments are telling you, because that's what's going to keep you safe. But very tragic, and we're very sad to see the loss of life that happened at that. But we can learn that nighttime spatial disorientation is a thing, and it doesn't matter what you're flying. It could be a Cessna. It can kill you just as easily. So anyway, let me know in the comments what you think. Thanks for watching. See you next time.